same thing. We may actually get to talk
Oh.
about that.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
They're not?
No, they're not.
Okay. So that's going out. See the little TV in there?
Mm-hmm.
This is what's going out.
Veterans for Peace.
Hey now, what's that sound I hear? That's the sound of the truth, ringing clear through the dark.
This was a turnout when
through the rain,
Barack Obama came to town the first time.
experience out on the street with the vets for peace. Oh, let the soldier tell the story, shout it out for peace.
Oh,
Greetings and salutations. This is VFP-TV and Radio, a production of the Veterans for Peace, Western North Carolina Chapter 99, with additional support from Peacetown and the War Resisters League of Asheville. If you would like to support VFP-TV and Radio, you may email us at vfptv@live.com. Once again, our email address is vfptv@live.com. My name is Ronald Hereda, and our guest host for today's show is Kim Carlisle. And Kim, you have brought somebody
Yes.
to the show today.
Yes, I'm very happy to have Dan Snyder with us tonight. Dan and I will talk about nonviolence and other related topics. So, by way of introduction, if you don't have announcements at this point.
No, that's all right. Go right ahead.
Okay. Dan has been studying and teaching nonviolence for over 30 years. Originally inspired by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, he has followed the trail of nonviolence through political work, a year with a community of Trappist monks, 2 seminary degrees, and finally a PhD in clinical psychology, where he focused his studies on the theories of the Swiss analytical psychologist Carl Jung. He has taught at Pendle Hill, the Quaker community near Philadelphia, where his work was focused on mentoring spiritually grounded activists. He now lives in the Asheville area and has a private practice as a pastoral counselor and spiritual director. In addition to his counseling practice, Dan offers consultation and workshops on nonviolence for church groups and others interested in the integration of spiritual, psychological, and political life. And you can learn more about Dan and contact him through his website, which is danielosnyder.com, and that's Snyder, S-N-Y-D-E-R, danielosnyder.com.
It's all one word.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great.
So, Dan, we just heard some of the things you've done, what you've done, and now I want to ask why you've done it. That is, what led you to devote your life energy to the study and teaching of nonviolence?
Yeah.
What life experiences?
Well, I was born in 1950, so I think we're probably all of the same generation. And that means, of course, that by the 60s I was a teenager, and by the 70s there was a whole lot more going on. So the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, everything that was going on during those decades impacted me enormously. And growing up in a world where it seemed to me like I was surrounded by wars, injustices of various kinds.
Riots in the streets.
Oh my, yes, all kinds of things. That to be a responsible citizen meant that I needed to figure out a way to respond to those things intelligently, effectively, and responsibly. And it was clear to me pretty early on that I was not going to be a good soldier. And it would be a big mistake for me to go that way.
I wish I would have learned that lesson.
And
earlier.
But you know what? I was very, very convicted by the kinds of things that people would sometimes say to me when I would say I was a conscientious objector. They would say, well, you know, somebody else is going to go in your place. And that had a powerful impact on me. And so it seemed to me that it was not okay to simply try to exempt myself from that war and then stand on the sidelines and not do anything. I felt a personal responsibility to to try to study what I thought was going on, not only in that war, but in war in general, and to make an effective and responsible response, including taking risks. I mean, obviously soldiers were taking huge risks. So it was important to me to not exempt myself from that. And that, of course, led to many steps, but ultimately it led to fascination with nonviolence. Not only its history, but in particular, why it works.
Mm-hmm. What was your first exposure, your first awakening to nonviolence? Was it what Martin Luther King was doing, or?
Well, I went. My first exposure was early '70s. I went to Philadelphia and I hooked up with a community of nonviolent activists in West Philadelphia, which is kind of a marginal neighborhood between the university area and really poor areas where there was a lot of gang violence. It was right on the edge, and this was a community of people who lived in common. They had like 20 different houses in West Philly, and were engaged every day in studying not only the problems that they wanted to address, but the methods for addressing them. And it was really there, it was a place called the Philadelphia Life Center, that I began to read Gandhi and King and Gene Sharp and a lot of other people who were thinking about nonviolent activism. These people were Quakers, and so they were already involved in anti-war kinds of activities. And I went there to learn from them, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that strikes me, and as you were talking, I was thinking of, I think Chuck Fager has made this observation, you know, Chuck Fager from Quaker House near Fort Bragg, that we have monuments and museums and all kinds of public displays set up to honor wars and warriors, and we really don't have enough devoted to peaceful people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you mentioned a few names, I bet a lot of the viewers and listeners that have never heard some of those names, like Gene Sharp,
Mm-hmm.
Which is sad because
Sure.
you know, they're powerful thinkers and activists, and I would say that a lot of viewers and listeners don't realize the effectiveness and the history of nonviolent movements for more than 100 years.
Oh, reaching back to the 4th century BC.
Yeah.
The history of nonviolence is thousands of years old. But you're right, it doesn't get reported, it doesn't get memorialized. And so it falls off the screen for a lot of people. We're not even aware of some of its history. We're aware of the history of wars, but not of nonviolence.
Well, wait a minute. You're saying that the churches and the synagogues and the mosques are not monuments to peace?
You're gonna put me on the spot, aren't you?
Oh, okay. Sorry. It seems more and more so that they're not. I mean, there doesn't seem to be, throughout the time that the same history that you talk about, there doesn't seem to have been a large religious resistance or resistance by religious groups to the obscenities of war.
Well, you know, I think what you're raising is similar to what Ken raised a minute ago, and that is we're not aware of the history, because what we get repeatedly put into the news is all the examples of ways in which institutions have become violent, and that's I think unfortunate, particularly with regard to the church, because there really has been a powerful peace church movement for a long time, and a lot of people aren't particularly aware of that. But there are many peace churches, and more churches that are identifying themselves as peace churches. And there's been a kind of a underside of the history of Christianity. Speaking as a Christian, I realize it also be true of other religions, but Christian is the tradition that I know. There's an underside of Christian history that a lot of people are not aware of. So we're aware of the Crusades, for example. We're aware of how Christianity served National Socialism in Nazi Germany. We're aware of how Christianity has been used to oppress women and gays and people of color and so on. What we're not aware of is that there have been powerful and inspiring movements within the church that have been profoundly nonviolent. So it's important to get the history out there.
In fact, I forget the year. It was fairly recently when the Philippines had a nonviolent revolution.
That's right.
And that was largely orchestrated by the Catholic Church there.
That's right.
So, but you don't hear about it. I bet a lot of people don't know that the Philippines had a nonviolent revolution.
Also true in Latin America. The church has been quite radical in many areas.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to talking about nonviolence.
Sure.
More directly, and just the term nonviolence. It's defined by being the opposite of violence.
Yeah.
So you would think you have to know what violence is in order to know what nonviolence is, and I think a lot of people would have some problems defining either one, violence or nonviolence. What would you? How do you respond?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit before we started. The term nonviolence, I think, is an unfortunate term in some ways because it always begs this question. It's defined by a negative. It's defined by what it's not.
Right.
Of course, alternatives have been proposed, but they also have problems, whether you want to call it truth force or soul force or ahimsa or some of these other terms. I stick with nonviolence just because it's the most commonly recognized term, and it's what Gandhi often used when he was using the English term, and also Martin Luther King. But it's still a somewhat difficult term. I long for the day when we struggle to understand what violence is, and the only way we can talk about it is saying it's not nonviolent.
I guess a positive term for me, and it's maybe not exactly the right thing, is something like solidarity.
Yeah.
You know, or unity or oneness. You know, if we recognize that we're all part of the same thing, but that's going in a slightly different direction.
Or
but
community
it's a positive term.
consciousness.
Yeah,
It
community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or how about pacifists?
Well, pacifism and nonviolence are not the same thing.
Oh.
And that's an important confusion, I think, to clear up for a lot of people, because a lot of people equate those two things. Pacifism is really a moral position. It's an ethical stance. There is active pacifism, of course, that it gets translated into action in the world. I would contrast that with nonviolence being primarily a strategic method for waging conflict. A lot of people wouldn't define it that way.
So, say that again.
A strategic method for waging conflict. You know, I think one of our charts might be helpful at this point. If we could move to the first chart, the 4-quadrant chart, that'll give us a way to think about some of the differences between violence and nonviolence. For example, a lot of people equate violence with conflict or coercion or force. It's really none of those things, because there are also nonviolent forms.
Can we get that chart?
Here we go.
Oh,
this,
good.
This is basically just a 4-quadrant chart that I use in my classes, where I contrast on the left side violence, on the right nonviolence, and then at the top conflict and the bottom peace, and that generates 4 terms. Well, we're used to pairing terms like violent conflict and perhaps nonviolent peace, but it's a little more outside the box for people to think of nonviolent conflict, especially for those who think that all conflict is violent. Nonviolence is a form of waging conflict. But in the lower left quadrant, this term, violent peace, is always one that generates a lot of puzzled looks. among students. And then I ask them, well, give me some examples of violent peace. And it comes around to things like institutionalized racism or the economic oppressions that are embedded